Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Welcome one and all to the Defiant Takes Football Show. I'm Max Dean. You can find me on Twitter at TheMaxDean. And I am here with Owen McCullor and Sam Goodman. So this is the official start of our new schedule. We will be going live at 11 p.m. Eastern every Monday and Thursday. And that is what we're doing tonight. We are going to be doing a little bit of draft recap, really our final thoughts on the matter. We haven't talked about every single team so far. You know, we haven't done a full 32 team episode. So we have a few left. Owen and I are going to talk about. But first, Sam is going to fill us in on the spring football league. He's going to kind of recap the XFL season a little bit. He's going to talk about the upcoming championship game. And then he's going to talk about the launch of the USFL season as well. And he was live in Detroit this past week. So lots of news there. Guys, thanks for joining me. First of all, Owen, how you doing, man? How are you feeling after this draft cycle?
I'm doing great. A little burnt out, as we always feel towards the end of it here, but still doing a little bit of stuff. I know I've been watching some of the prospects the Bills drafted, specifically. I got to get to Justin Shorter just to see what we got there with the wide receiver. But for the most part, I'm ready to move on, take like a month off, and then get diving right into summer scouting for 2024.
Yeah, I feel that. We're going to knock out some of the players that went in the first round, early in the second round, for a couple more video reviews before we move on to our summer scouting and then NFL tape. So some interesting stuff to look at there. Emmanuel Forbes will be out either tomorrow if you're watching live or today if you're listening after the fact or watching. But Sam, man, you must be feeling pretty good, right? So you follow the Detroit Lions along with all of the spring football stuff, and they got out with quite the haul. So how you doing today, man?
Yeah, I'm feeling great. I think it was an interesting response, definitely from Detroit too, because day one it was shocking, right? I mean, a running back and a linebacker were definitely not what everyone expected, especially with the huge need for a defensive line, and people flipped out. And Ben Bosher, who also writes for Defiant Takes, we were doing our live show on the Forward Down the Field podcast, and we both were just kind of dumbfounded at what the pick was, and it took a full day for it to set in and for us to realize, like, sometimes you don't have to address like your most glaring needs to have a good draft, and there are also good prospects later. Sometimes it's about those high impact players, but this whole draft was chaotic, so it was a lot of fun.
Well, we've talked about the Lions ad nauseum on the show so far because obviously a little bit of a surprise with the first night, but also they got quite the haul down the line. I was pretty impressed with what they did. So we won't spend too much time on them right now. And I suppose we might as well jump into the spring football stuff, man. So where do you want to start? Should we talk about the XFL season that was and kind of lead into the championship game?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It was a pretty successful season for the XFL's relaunch. 8 teams, obviously. And they started with 2 divisions where the top 2 teams in each division would make the playoffs. And the North Division was like much more competitive than the South, and it was like a glaring difference. And honestly kind of a problem, which leads into the championship matchup, which will be May 13th at 8 p.m. in San Antonio at the Alamo Dome. But in terms of the actual regular season itself, the North had the best team in the league in DC. They had the highest points for, the best offense, the coach of the year in Reggie Barlow. Their defense was pretty solid. And, funny enough, they lost their first game, but then they just decided to win 9 straight and dominate the entire league. They were pretty unbeatable. And now they're playing in the championship game, just continuing that journey from week one's loss all the way to the top and just staying up there. But in the North, they had a little bit of controversy going into the playoffs because the Seattle Sea Dragons, led by Ben DiNucci and former NFL receiver Josh Gordon, they went 7-3 and made the playoffs in the second spot, losing to DC in the North Championship game, or the North Division final. and they tied with St. Louis, the Battlehawks, who have a huge following, obviously, and have sold out their arena multiple times, which is a big thing for, a spring football league. The Battlehawks led by A.J. McCarron, the former Bama star, and then a league-leading receiver in Hakeem Butler, who sent his tape on Twitter directly to their head coach before the season started to get signed. So showing how some of these guys can be pretty unknown and then have amazing seasons, which is a really cool thing about spring football. But they had a great year. They went 7-3 and lost the head-to-head matchup with Seattle. And then on a missed extra point in the final week, Seattle was able to win their last game and make it into the playoffs. So that was a brutal heartbreak for those very passionate Battlehawks fans. And that was the North Division because essentially the Vegas Vipers were a nothing team. They rounded out the North with a very poor 2-8 record and only had some highlights because of their quarterback Luis Perez, who was phenomenal. He's a spring football legend at this point, and then was released by the team because they needed to do something to try to turn their season around. But really, their only big news came from playing on a terrible field, which was a converted minor league baseball stadium with painted grass. Their opening game was in the worst conditions. It was just drizzling rain, like that light rain that really sets into the grass, and it was so hard to watch because people were slipping all over the place. The grass was flying up, and the paint got undone, and the lines were uneven. So it was the worst look possible for the XFL. But from there, the league seemed to bounce back pretty well and have a lot of very solid showings, including this past weekend with the South Division final with the Houston Roughnecks, who were 7-3 and a strong team all year, clinching the top seed in the South, because they fell short to the Arlington Renegades, led by Bob Stoops, obviously a coaching legend in college football, and they were a team that honestly had a poor season as well, a 4-6 record and the third worst point differential in the league. But it goes to show the, craziness of spring football, how a team like that really shouldn't have even been in competition for a championship or even a playoff spot, but they made the playoffs and they shocked the Roughnecks and are now looking to continue their Cinderella story into a championship game against the best team in the league. And honestly, I think there's going to be a pretty intense game for a lot of these guys because there's some really passionate players out there when it comes to the XFL.
So that's pretty cool. So, Owen, I personally have not really been able to keep up with the XFL at all, right? Working, family, draft cycle, all that stuff. Have you been able to watch? I mean, you got school, you're doing the draft stuff too, but have you been able to keep up a little bit more with the XFL than myself?
Yeah, I actively was trying to make time to find areas to watch it, stuff like that. Over on my YouTube channel, I actually did XFL Power Rankings every week, and now I have my buddy doing the USFL Power Rankings for the channel now. So I was trying to keep up with every game. I missed like a game here or there, but I have ESPN Plus, so I was able to go back and watch like the replays whenever I had like a break in school or something like that, or whenever I just needed to change up from watching prospects. So I'd watch like a couple games in a day and be like, okay, let me just change it up here and go watch some XFL stuff. So I've also been a big fan of spring football ever since it's been kind of introduced back in, I think it was like 2019 with the AAF. I've been a big fan of it ever since then. So a lot of the guys who are in this current XFL league and even USFL, I've been recognized with like Luis Perez, who he brought up is one of the guys who was there from like the beginning of the spring football league, where he was a D2 quarterback who like taught himself how to play quarterback through YouTube videos. And now he's like one of these more recognizable names in the league. He's actually, when he mentioned the Vipers cut him earlier in the season, he's now the quarterback of the Renegades who came in and beat the Roughnecks. So now he's in the championship. And then you got guys who I saw in like draft cycles previous, including the last one, where the DC Defenders they drafted Abram Smith, the running back out of Baylor, who was an undrafted free agent last year. He was the number 1 overall draft pick for the XFL skill position draft. And he kind of finally started showing up. I think he had like a 200-yard game against the Battlehawks. Like that was his first like big breakout moment. So I wasn't the biggest fan of his when he was coming out of college. But then there were guys like Hakeem Butler, who I was like, this was before I really got into draft stuff, where I was just kind of like a passerby and I would just read what people said. And I was infatuated by him because he was so big and lanky, and I would watch his highlights and he'd be mossing guys. And then he gets drafted in the 4th round, is like tried to be converted to a tight end by the Eagles, and then finally mixed into this league, and he's really showing out. There's guys like that. So I've tried to keep up the best I can, just because I know there's guys I recognize from my times watching college football, doing draft stuff and things like that, and also just watching spring football before I really got deep into doing all this stuff. So I've kept kept on the pulse of that kind of stuff.
So if you're going to give us a little bit of a preview between these two teams, I mean, you can go so far as prediction if you want to. What do you expect out of this championship game? And just also, if you have any kind of estimate, what do you think this is going to pull in viewership?
Well, throughout the season, the viewership has varied, from 250,000 viewers at one point to, 1.5, 1.75, even up to the 2 million mark. And I expect this game to do around 1.5, 1.75 when it comes to viewers, just because DC has a very passionate fan base, obviously, with the beer snake and everything. And Arlington's story has been followed pretty closely, and their fan base is sort of latched on to that just as they've started to make this run. And obviously, that's kind of how it works with spring football, right? Your team's doing well, there's a game to go watch. And with Arlington being, close enough to San Antonio, I think they'll draw some attendance as well. But in terms of the actual game itself, this is the most opposites, attract kind of matchup, right? DC dominated the league, and Arlington just kind of scraped their way by. It's kind of crazy, but the key for Arlington is going to be their defense. Head coach Bob Stoops has really focused on that the entire season long, and they managed to hold Houston, who had a solid offense all season long, to just a season low 11 points in their win on Saturday. DC, that rushing attack you talked about, Owen talked about Abram Smith, that's going to be a big issue for them, I think, though. Smith, he obviously led the XFL in rushing yards. He had almost 750 yards, and the defenders ran for a league best almost 1,500 yards. They had a strong passing game with quarterback Jordan Ta'amu, who's been a spring football, legend as well at this point, and almost had 2,000 yards in passing during the regular season, and that was the third most in the XFL. So it's going to be, I think, who plays the cleanest game. And that's a key thing with spring football everywhere, which is a lot of these guys, they're trying to make big plays and put together highlight film to try to make it back to the NFL. And a lot of the time, there's a lot of unforced errors. I mean, interceptions have been a big thing in the league. Whichever team plays the cleanest football is going to win to me. I think the Renegades are going to be forced a little bit too far outside their comfort zone, just trying to keep up with all the firepower that the defenders have. And because of that, and because of Luis Perez, who we mentioned as their quarterback in Arlington, he's having sort of a turnover-prone season with the third most in the league. I think just playing from behind, which I expect from them, and struggling to keep up with, again, the firepower of DC's offense, I think that the fairy tale season, or at least comeback season, ends in the title game for the Renegades. I think the defenders covered the spread here, which is, I believe, -9. And I think it's going to be like 30-12 in my eyes.
Okay, wow. Well, we'll see. I think it's fun for these cities who have been missing football for a long time. And, you talk about St. Louis. For one, you talk about DC, and look, obviously they have the Commanders, but I think a lot of fans have felt like they didn't have a team there just because they have not agreed with the way things that have been run with Daniel Snyder and the whole 9 yards there. So I feel like this has been really, really fun for them to latch on to as well. So if they win it all, this is going to feel really, really good for them. And I know that there's some optimism about the Commanders this year.
Yeah.
But they will essentially, they're a pretty talented team, but they'll go as far as their quarterback situation allows, right? So this will be a really nice win for them if they can take this home and kind of go into this season and kind of see, how things go. And then maybe they have 2 good back-to-back seasons, but we'll see. But this is kind of a nice little gift for them, I would say, for sure. And I know that Nick has been really enjoying this run as well. So let's look forward to the USFL a little bit, right? So the season is officially underway. You were there in Detroit this past week. And I guess let's talk about how those first 3 weeks have gone and your overall thoughts and your experience being there live.
Yeah, so the USFL went off to a slower start because of the XFL's success, right? So the XFL launched earlier and, was in their mid-season by the time the USFL was starting. And so the first couple weeks, the first two really, did not pull the largest viewers because people were really invested in what the XFL had to offer. And the first 2 weeks kind of went as people expected, right? So Birmingham, the Stallions, who had a great season last year, were off to a good start. New Jersey, same thing, off to a good start. And the teams that struggled were also struggling again, except for the Michigan Panthers, who, much to my joy, have been kind of turning it around, except for, last week when I actually get to see them play in person. But they were off to a 2-0 start as well. And week 3 is really when the viewership started to pick up. It got to around 500,000 viewers for most of the games, at 250 at the lowest. And that was when people really started to invest more time into the teams themselves, the live attendance, even though it's not being given to us in the media world by the league. They're trying to keep that, honestly, in their own pocket at Fox Sports. But it started to pick up, and it was very noticeable in Ford Field, especially because, that's the first time spring football has been in Detroit in a long time, right? It's been 40 years since the Michigan Panthers have played, and they were, champions back in 1983. So it's a big deal. I mean, there are a lot of fans who remember that, and also a new generation being introduced to it. And I think that's kind of the key with a lot of this stuff, especially with the USFL and the history it has. The XFL, it's still newer considering, it started in 2001, whereas the USFL has a rich history of, 4 years in the 80s where people were really attached to the teams and the names involved. And that's carried over and hopefully will continue to, because the league's starting to put a lot of solid play on the field. The scoring has improved since last season. The turnover rate's gone down. Some big names are starting to pop up, and the teams themselves have started to really settle in, whereas last year the rosters were constantly fluctuating just because they had to have their draft, sign guys, continuously go about signing and dropping throughout training camp, and then throughout the season they still didn't really know who they wanted, so they were signing guys from all these different rosters from the league who had just been getting dropped throughout the season. This year it's kind of familiar names, so for Michigan, it's running back Reggie Corbin and Josh Love. For Philly, it's Case Cookus. In Memphis, they have a CFL legend, McLeod Bethel Thompson, and a lot of these guys have actual names that bring a fan base with them, whether they're out of college or not. So now with the USFL, we're starting to see more fans come in, and it was, again, noticeable in Ford Field. We were reporting around 10,000 fans to be, honestly, a little stern. People, there were noticeable empty seats, and so reporters didn't, want to just give a tally of, it's, 20,000. But when you really looked into it, and what a lot of the more spring football pro writers were saying was, maybe around 10 to 15 at Ford Field, and also in Memphis for opening weekend. And those were the biggest drawing crowds for the week. And the league is starting to catch on, especially now with some strong performances offensively from New Jersey, who just absolutely dominated the Michigan Panthers. And then defensively too, with Pittsburgh having, a turnaround game where they started 0-2 and just won their first game with a really strong defensive performance over Philly, who has been a strong offense for all the way since last season. Now we have week 4 coming up, where there are some good games, especially at Ford Field, with the Michigan Panthers playing a 0-3 Memphis team that is new, quote unquote. They're returning and struggling, but just found a strong quarterback in, oh my God, blanking on the name right now. That's on me. I'll come back to it. But essentially, the situation has kind of settled down there, and they had a strong performance, but have allowed the most points in the season, a league-leading 99. And now in Michigan with Carson Strong, the former Nevada quarterback, and Josh Love, who played at oh my God, San Diego State. They're kind of struggling to figure out the quarterback situation there. That could be an upset that people need to pay attention to. Houston playing Philly. Philly has really struggled to start the year, especially on offense. Things just aren't clicking. And Houston has Kenji Bahar at quarterback, where he's just elevated that offense to a point where his ability to run and take off out of the pocket has really helped them, put up, 29, 38, and 31 points in the first couple weeks, but the defense has struggled. But against a weak Philly team, they might be able to turn their season into 500 and start pushing for a playoff spot. And New Orleans and New Jersey, I think, is really the game to watch for anyone who hasn't watched anything in the league yet, because these are two of the teams at the top of the league, best of the best, where if you tune into this game without any knowledge of the USFL, there is going to be a solid product for you to watch. So you're going to have a 3-0 New Orleans team who has come into the league dominating on offense, and then a New Jersey team who has started, with a loss and then turned it around, 2 wins, and have a crazy offense with their rushing attack of Darius Victor, their running back, who is a bowling ball of a receiving back and also right out of the backfield, and then their dual threat quarterback DeAndre Johnson, but also a strong defense led by Chris Orr. And so those are all names that you're going to be hearing a lot, and it's going to be a really close game in Canton, Ohio. So definitely some stuff to check out with the USFL this week.
It's not surprising to me that the viewership has gone up over the past couple of weeks as the XFL winds up, certainly in terms of the playoffs and the championship, but winds down in terms of how many people have their team to watch every single week, right? People are kind of also realizing, all right, I'm not going to have this team to root for anymore. Let me kind of turn my attention to see what else is going on out there as we wait for training camp. Plus, we were right at the height of draft season too, and that's still very, very popular. You know what I mean? People are spending a lot of time and researching players and figuring out who it is that their team just drafted. So it doesn't surprise me that after that we're seeing more. So Owen, is there anybody in the USFL right now that you kind of had your eye on, that you've scouted previously and you're interested to see if they break out here at some point?
Yeah, so first off, just because I fact-checked it real quick, I think Cole Kelly is the quarterback from Memphis. He's somebody who went undrafted last year in 2022. I didn't get eyes on him, but I've heard people talk about him. He was a quarterback for Arkansas, transferred to Southern Louisiana. So he's somebody who I knew his name when the USFL started. Other guys were like Carson Strong, who's in a backup role right now. He was talked about. It was kind of a weaker quarterback class last year when it was Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis, things like that. Strong was floated as to be one of those guys who could potentially skill-wise, coming out of Nevada, be one of those guys who could be one of the top quarterbacks taken. However, he had a degenerative knee issue that came out. So he went undrafted, signed with the Eagles for a little bit, and just kind of floated out. Other than that, not a lot of like big time names that I've taken note of. I believe, I don't know if I remember this correctly or not, I think Thaddeus Moss might be somebody who was signed at least initially. It was one of the recognizable names. I think it's Randy Moss's either son or nephew or something like that. He was in there for a little bit. Yeah. Other than that, I was watching the league a little bit last year. So it's names like Case Cookus and Billy Gaither for the Maulers and other guys like that who I remember from last year and really taking note of, and kind of not scouting the league itself, taking note, putting a little bit of that kind of knowledge and practice I have watching the games. Okay, this guy has this kind of thing. Really kind of look at okay, which of these guys can be like the Cavante Turpin, or when we look at the XFL, like a Ja'Cour Pearson, who's going to be moving on to the NFL once these leagues are over, because they've exhibited stuff that you can clearly see is above and beyond some of the other teams' capabilities, other players' capabilities in this league. So a lot of these guys, Case Cookus probably would have been on the roster. I believe he was signed by the Rams for a little bit, but he broke his ankle in the championship game, if I'm remembering correctly. So there's guys who you'll go in and see, okay, maybe even if I didn't see these guys coming out of the draft, while there are still some of those guys there, a lot of these guys are just returning players who are trying to get that rub that they really didn't get the year prior, with another year in the system, another year of exposure on this more unopposed spring football, because once XFL is over, they're really going to be the only thing that's on TV when it comes to football. There's not going to be much competition, and they'll be able to get their names out there and get scouted, especially around these times where there's going to be OTAs and other camps that they're just going to need bodies for with their rookies coming in, things like that. that they're going to need guys who are in shape and ready to play football to come out and play. And we saw like with a guy like Devontae Turpin who signed with the Cowboys, he played like 29 football games in the calendar year of like 2022 or something crazy like that. So there's going to be guys who got playing experience through the USFL that are going to be playing there. So it does benefit if you go through and without as much college football to go scout, unless you're going back and watching some past games, to watch these new spring leagues and really take it in as like, okay, these are going to be guys that are going to be potentially waiver fodder for the league and going to be filling out depth. So let's see who could we really see here showing out and could be a potential NFLer come the end of this season.
Yeah, there's a few guys that jump out in terms of names I know. Jay Sternberger is one. Corbin Kaufusi is another. There's also Breland Speaks here. And so, I'm interested to see what happens with Carson Strong because he had the knee issue, and so nobody really wanted to take a swing on him. And it could be even really rough for him in the USFL, but he has about as good as arm as just about anybody out there. So he is a highlight reel waiting to happen. And against potentially questionable defensive play at times, we could see some really fun stuff, some stuff that's going to make its way onto Sports Center, and definitely he can make a name for himself. And he's a guy who he will also, I think, garner a lot of fan love because he played through the knee condition. He decided not to get surgery because he wanted to be out there his last year at Nevada. And I think overall that wasn't the best decision for him long term, but he's that kind of guy. He's dedicated to playing with his teammates, and so he'll lay it all out there on the field. So I'm curious to see how his season plays out. Hopefully well, because he's a guy that you kind of root for. But yeah, all right, man. I really appreciate you coming on. We're going to have you on every week for the rest of the spring football season. Now that we have concluded draft season and we're kind of finding our way back into the world of actually being scheduled, we're able to put that together. So Sam Goodman, he is our lead spring football analyst. Appreciate you. You can find him at Sam_Goodman18 on Twitter. You can check out Forward Down the Field, which is the Detroit Lions podcast, and of course all of his written work over at DefiantTakesFootball.com. Sam, thank you very much, and we will see you very soon.
Thank you.
All right, Owen, it is time to talk NFL draft.
All right. I'm surprised. That's like a total low-key topic. Not a lot of people are talking about that recently,
Yeah. We're the only ones. Yeah, we're the only live stream out there. We're the only podcast talking about the NFL draft these days.
Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about some of the big draft classes so far. We've talked about the Lions a lot. We've talked about the Eagles. We've talked about a lot of the teams that are kind of consensus, very, very good drafts. And some, honestly, that we just outright disagree with, right? Like I was a little bit critical of Arizona, even though I think a lot of people are very high on him. A lot of people had Paris Johnson Jr. as their top tackle. And I understand that from a projection standpoint, but like for me, that's six is rich, right? So
yeah, I wasn't the highest on Paris Johnson. So when moving up into dressing tackle was definitely something they should have done. So I can see where you're coming from with that specifically.
Right. So let's talk about some of the teams that we haven't talked about quite as much. The Buffalo Bills are one that we haven't commented on that much. We certainly touched on the tight end pick in the first round, but we haven't talked about them once the rest of their draft was assembled. So considering that's the team that you are most closely affiliated with, what were your thoughts on the draft? I mean, I think getting Torrance in the second was huge. I thought that was a big hit. But aside from that, or including that, what were your thoughts on the Buffalo Bills draft?
Yeah, I feel like the Kincaid pick in round 1 and Torrance in round 2 really plays into kind of like the same talking point. A lot of people have had kind of taken away from this. And it was one of the things I talked about right after the first round happened, where people were kind of ridiculing it, like, why do we need a tight end kind of thing, where linebacker was a big need, interior defensive line, wide receiver even, or interior offensive line, were all of these bigger needs. People, especially on like Bills fan pages, stuff like that, they were not letting off Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott lately for that pick. And now with the addition of O'Cyrus Torrance, I'm pretty confident in backing up the stance I had when they first took Kincaid, was back when Brian Dable was the offensive coordinator here, they had always been stressing and making it trying to make sure that they can start establishing more of a 12 personnel kind of set, where they brought in Tyler Croft for the 2020 season. They drafted Tommy Sweeney, who, due to COVID had a heart issue, and he hasn't really been the same since. He's just been dealing with injuries a lot, so he probably isn't going to pan out, despite I liked him coming out of Boston College. We brought in O.J. Howard, which was a failed experiment, and then now we have Quentin Morris, he's a fine blocker enough, but you can really look to improve there. And with Dawson Knox really improving after being a quarterback high school recruit coming in, he's really improved his blocking. And even though he's not a great receiver, he's still probably one of those more all-around tight ends in the league. You bring a guy like Kincaid in, who, while people were clamoring for them to take a wide receiver, 4 had just gone off consecutive picks right before we traded up, people were still wanting them to go and get another weapon for Josh. And I feel like Kincaid, while not being the best blocker when it comes to inline tight end, really fulfills the need for both wanting to move more towards 12 personnel and running the football, as well as giving Allen a secondary receiving option, because Kincaid was really that kind of like big slot or sniffer tight end who was more of that move guy who would go on motion and kick out the D end with a full head of steam, as opposed to just straight up 1v1 blocking him like a Darnell Washington would. So they grab Kincaid and they'll probably put him in the slot or coming off the line of scrimmage and really have him attack that short to intermediate range, where Gabe Davis kind of struggled last year for the Bills, was that he had a 50% catch rate. And it was mostly due in the short to intermediate range, where when he was going down deep and stretching the field, he had a lot more success. So the Kincaid pick I was a big fan of. Not a lot of people were at this time. And then when he come back in the second round, a lot of people kind of felt more warmly on the Kincaid pick, since they said if you swapped the Osiris Torrance pick and Kincaid, they'd be more happy with it, kind of thing. But Torrance being a guy who I felt was kind of a top of the second round, maybe mid-second round kind of pick. So I felt like they got a proper value there when it came to who they were taking. The only reason why I had him with that value instead of being a first round guy is because he is a dominant run blocker. He's a big man. He can absorb contact. He can dish out power. He's just overall a very big, powerful guard. However, the fact that he is guard, he didn't really try out any other positions when he was at Florida, really limits the amount of versatility he's going to have there. And I didn't really see him as like a zone blocking kind of guard. However, the Bills with that pick and now with the Kincaid pick signaling they want to go more 12 personnel is really trying to move more towards what they've been trying to establish ever since Josh Allen's been emerging as the quarterback, which was running the football and really trying to give that secondary or balanced offense that Josh Allen needs. Where Osiris Torrance is going to be that guy who can be a road grader right in the middle of the field. And while you have a developmental guy at right tackle with Spencer Brown that I'm not ready to kick the can on yet, or to wave a white flag on yet, they're going to try to emphasize running the football, and Osiris Torrance is going to have an opportunity to come in and win one of those starting guard spots over Connor McGovern or Ryan Bates. And then having 2 tight ends in the field is really just going to help out with the numbers game there. So they're really signaling with those first 2 picks, like, hey, we're going to start running the ball more. We want to take the ball out of Allen's hands more, have him get hit less. And that's kind of signaled to a lot of fans what they were looking to do with that kind of draft class and what they were trying to set up there. Moving on to the 3rd round pick, Dorian Williams, another guy I thought like they had appropriate value for. I had him as a 3rd round guy, converted safety, one of the longest arms in the draft class. So despite him being like only 6'1", 225, he still has that length to be able to stack and shed and impact passing lanes, which, talking about Tremaine Edmonds and losing him there in the middle linebacker position, that was kind of his big thing. Was he was 6'5", and while he wasn't the best in coverage and couldn't really match up with these slot receivers, he had the length to really affect passing lanes and things like that without having to be this kind of sticky coverage guy. So they're really not losing all that length in the middle of the field when it comes to Dorian Williams or Tremaine Edmonds to Dorian Williams. But also Brandon Beane went on a podcast and talked about their picks kind of, and he, amongst other things, and he talked about Dorian Williams and said Tremaine, while giving him his flowers for being a good player and a good leader, said that he struggled when they asked him to maybe go out and cover like some smaller slot guys or these shiftier tight ends. And we've seen plays like that when they lost to the Bucks last season, where there was 2 seasons ago when there was a big overtime play where their slot receiver really broke it over big to the middle for a big touchdown to close the game out when Tremaine was in coverage. So they believe that Dorian Williams is going to be that guy who can replace Tremaine's length, won't be lost too much in the shuffle of the box with all these different linemen because he has that length, and as well can be more athletically more athletically capable of covering these slot guys, whereas Tremaine really was kind of that bigger guy who's the best ability in coverage was just his length and things like that. So I think it's more of a scheme fit and what they want out of their middle linebacker without really sacrificing all that much when it comes to what they really liked about Tremaine when they drafted him back in 2018.
Yeah, I think when you look at the first couple of picks, guard was a need, right? Well, just offensive line in general was a need. They needed to get stouter there, and I think Torrance at the spot where he was picked at 59th overall was good value. He's a day one ready player. I think he has functional athleticism for the guard position. He definitely does not have really viable athleticism for tackle, so I think it's it's pretty understandable why he played the position that he did without really trying to switch things up there at all. Better be the best that you can at one position versus, you know what I mean, potentially being a sixth round pick as a tackle or just being moved to guard at the NFL level anyway. So I think he's great. He has a ton of power. He's a good run blocker, a really good run blocker, and he is an intelligent pass blocker as well. And so he can absorb anything that you have in the middle, no problem. So I feel like that was really more of the day one ready starter that they got out of their first few picks. But Kincaid to me is a swing for the fences. And also, I think what they really want is versatility because now, right? So if you put out there this personnel package, so you've got Stephon Diggs, you got Gabe Davis, and then you got Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox, and then you got James Cook out of the backfield. Then you've got a group that can run the ball, right? Because it's a heavy personnel set. Now, are any of those guys dominant in the run game? No, they're not, right? Like James Cook's a little undersized. Dawson Knox is a better blocker than he was. Dalton Kincaid's not really that much of a blocker, but they are all tremendous pass catchers. I mean, Dawson Knox probably being the least of them, but still good, right? He's a viable pass catcher. Dalton Kincaid is a field stretcher, great athlete. James Cook can do all kinds of stuff. You know what I mean? And you expect him to develop a little bit more coming in his second year. So what I see is a personnel package that is designed to force you into more of a coverage defense because the average base defense is the average 3-4, 4-3, whatever, or potentially even big nickel is going to struggle against that in coverage. So you're going to want your faster, smaller players out there to deal with that. And as soon as you do, they just get into run plays and try and make that a mismatch for you. So, or vice versa. If you put your big package out there, then they just try and throw it all over the place on you. And so that's what I see. I see an attempt to create versatility and do maybe not exactly what the 49ers do, but the essence of what they do so well is to just get guys who do a few different things well and then force you to mismatch somewhere. And so that's kind of what I see as opposed to just wanting to be able to necessarily run the ball more, just more about dictating who you have on the field and then kind of taking advantage of that, So let's move on to another team that we haven't talked much about, considering they picked highly and got a new quarterback. The Indianapolis Colts. Colts end up taking Anthony Richardson, 4th overall, which I don't think was a surprise really to anybody. There were a lot of people still talking about them loving Will Levis more than anybody else. There was a lot of talk about them potentially not getting their guy if a team were to jump them and get up to pick number 3, and then they're sitting at number 4, having to take the 4th guy who maybe they didn't love as much. But they walk away with Anthony Richardson. They get Julius Brents in the 2nd round, Josh Downs in the 3rd round, who I am in love with. I love Josh Downs. I think he's a tremendous player, and it's also nice that he's kind of very, very specifically different from the body type that they've had at receiver and have currently. Gives them a little bit more versatility. And then they get Blake Freeland in the 4th, as well as Adiba Ware and Darius Rush in the 5th, Daniel Scott in the 5th, Will Mallory in the 5th, Evan Hull in the 5th, and then a few more guys in the 6th, 7th. So they've got some seriously athletic players here. Certainly Will Mallory, Diba then and Downs is very athletic despite his size. So they added a lot to this team, and obviously the most athletic quarterback in the entire draft, maybe in the past, quite a few drafts. So what was
I'd
your
say
take
ever,
on this?
probably.
Yeah, ever. Well, analytically speaking, yeah. I mean, depending on how you want to phrase it, but yeah, they've got ridiculous athletes this past weekend. So how did you feel about that draft?
Yeah, I felt like if any team was going to take Richardson, the Colts going for him would probably have been the best. Now I know I'm a big Will Levis fan. A lot of people are, and clearly the NFL was. I'm not sure how much the toe injury they talked about on draft day really impacted him all that much. But yeah, Richardson going to a team that now has the offensive coordinator as their head coach, who helped really mold Jalen Hurts into what he has become this past season. I feel like that was a good opportunity for him. The only thing I didn't like about the landing spot for Richardson to the Colts, where I like Levis more, was that they didn't really have that entrenched, established starter that's going to be able to prevent them from forcing Richardson on the field. They have Gardner Minshew penciled in the starter right now, but like if he has one off game, which he hasn't really been that guy that we've seen since his rookie year in Jacksonville. While I'm still a fan of him and he is a hard worker and is going to be that guy who's going to be able to go out there and will benefit from a strong running game and things like that they have there in Indianapolis. I don't know if he's really going to be that guy that's going to, the fans going to be like, well, we can't take him out for Richardson. It's like, we'll throw the young guy in. Gardner Minshew didn't throw for over 300 yards this game kind of thing. So there's going to be pressure to start him right away. At the same time, Richardson only played, I think it was 13 games in college. So having him come in and just, trial by fire and getting some of those play snaps may be even better for him, just because, the best way he could probably learn is just by playing more games, playing more football. So that could be a dual sword there, whether I don't think he's a perfect fit to start day one, but at the same time, if you do start on day one, I can see the positives there just because he didn't start all that much in college. Moving on to the other guys they grabbed, they did have a weakness at outside corner. They brought in Stephon Gilmore last year. And grabbing a guy like Julius Brents, who has all that length and athleticism and really lit up the draft cycle from like the Senior Bowl on, that's going to be probably the guy they're going to slot in to be their starting outside corner. And then bring another guy in later rounds like Darius Rush, who wasn't the number one corner in South Carolina and probably would have projected better to slot. He has the opportunity to win any kind of job there, or really be their primary number 4 or number 3 corner in the Colts. So he might see some playing time, especially with a division now that has Trevor Lawrence, CJ Stroud, and I mean the Titans have gone so many different ways with their quarterback position. We don't really know what's going on there, but they're going to be in a more pass happy division, at least in the short term, with how many other good quarterbacks have been added there. With adding Josh Downs, they did bring in Isaiah McKenzie from the Bills. Who's kind of he's an undersized guy, so you think he's gonna be playing the slot. But what the Bills tried to do with him last year was make him more of that route running kind of player, where he was really before that just a gimmick touch, jet sweep, get an open field, use your speed kind of guy. It just wasn't really working out that way, and he kind of lost traction in that offense once he wasn't really to evolve his game. So bring a guy in like Downs, who is that more traditional slot route running kind of guy, who does have some sneaky athleticism that a lot of people don't really talk about just because he is undersized. I think that's really like a better, more prototypical slot than a guy like McKenzie is, where McKenzie can now be your 4th receiver. Don't really rely on him to be a volume catch kind of guy or be that guy who moves the change on third downs. That'll be Downs' job, and you can really now flex McKenzie into more of that trickery, motion, get the box moving to allow Jonathan Taylor some more holes in the running game. Going into other guys like Adebawore, they made a big show to trade for DeForest Buckner and then draft a guy like Kwity Paye to be their defensive ends in this defensive system. And whether or not it's going to be the same system with the coaching changeover that they have, I doubt they're going to come in and overchange it all with how many different kinds of players they are. And with the drafting of Adebawore, I think he kind of fits the mold of what like a DeForest Buckner or a Kwity Paye does, where they're these bigger bodied guys who can kick inside and play D tackle. But if you have them playing at like a 5-tech D end, using that explosiveness and having that undersized ability or the undersized frame not really impact them as much. I feel like that's probably the best mold for them, especially because he can come in now and learn from a guy like Buckner or a high pick like Paye. So if again, another team where I felt like Adebawore could have gone to really, be the most successful player he could be. So they really drafted guys that I thought highly of in the first place, but also when I drafted him, I looked at their roster and looked at the kind of scheme they run and who other kind of players they have there. And I'm like, wow, they really drafted players that not only are they good players, but they fit what they need or fit like the kind of things they want to do as a team. So Richardson has that rushing quarterback, that kind of Jalen Hurts raw mold. Adebawore is that athletic 5-tech DN who can kick inside and rush from like a 3-tech if they go down to an even front. You have Josh Downs to be that traditional slot to open up Isaiah McKenzie and really complement the bigger bodied guys like Michael Pittman they have there. And Blake Freeland to tackle out of BYU, just another guy that could probably develop with their tackle tandem being all right and get in aging as the time comes by. So they could probably develop him a little bit. I feel like they drafted well, both value wise and fit wise. So it was one of the more underrated drafts in my opinion. Even if people are critical of the Richardson pick, because he is so raw and that they don't really have that immediate successor to prevent him from pushing that quarterback to start.
I think that it's not a big deal as long as they do it right as far as the quarterback position goes, because for me, if you have quite a few built-in touches via the run game and you create situations where, you get him on the move and he only has to read half the field, and then you have the defense that's threatened by his ability to carry the ball, that really takes a lot off of the plate of a rookie quarterback. You're not asking him to drop back and read the defense over and over and over and deal with all of these unique looks that they're giving him, because you're dictating how the defense reacts a lot more than you normally would if you're doing traditional dropbacks. Now, ultimately, you need an incredible athlete to do that, right? It's otherwise just everybody would do it. But they have that in Anthony Richardson now. So I think it's not going to be perfect, but if you want to find a pathway to early success for Richardson despite his lack of experience, that would be it. Probably high volume of carries early on. You know what I mean? I think we could see, the best possible outcome would be something somewhat in the realm of what Lamar Jackson did in his second year, right? Or maybe in his first year, if we want to be a little bit more realistic, where he played only towards the end of the year, but that rushing ability was very, very apparent right away. So I think you do that, and then you overcome some of the issues with the offensive line, and you overcome some of the issues with the understanding of NFL caliber defenses, and then you try and add to that over time, and then the next offseason you really spend some more time on it, because it's going to be tough. I mean, they haven't fixed their offensive line nearly enough for Gardner Minshew to have a really comfortable time back there. They're still going to need to work Jonathan Taylor back from injury as well, so we don't know what he's necessarily going to look like. So we'll see. We'll see how their offensive system looks, but I think there is a pathway for success there. And I think when you look at Josh Downs, just based on the offensive systems that Steichen ran with Philly and like a lot of the offshoots of that small inside slot receiver who's like a traditional route runner and super shifty, you don't see that quite as much. You know what I mean? You get some speed guys there, but there's a lot of 12 personnel. And I almost feel like this player was kind of just a value pick where they're like, it's not necessarily exactly what we thought was going to be our base offense. Like our base personnel for offense is 11 personnel, but this guy's just too good to pass on at 79th overall. That's how I felt. Like if you're anywhere into the second round, I'm like, this guy's an easy pick. And then at some point as you get towards the third, and you got to, at 79, I'm not really sure how he fell that far. It's just size, I guess. It's funny how size is just overlooked for some players, and for others, it's like, oh, can't touch him, because he does everything else phenomenally well. So I'm not sure exactly how he fits early, and like if they have a plan for him, if they're like, or if she's like, he's just the best player on our board and we just got to take him, So
yeah,
that could definitely have been the case.
I'm a little worried with him early on in their system because when he was at North Carolina, Drake May wasn't this particularly like, extend the play with his legs, keep the play alive kind of quarterback. He was really that kind of drop back read, make the right throw, and he did that successfully. However, when he did have to extend the plays and things like that, and even when he was with Downs with Sam Howell, those guys didn't really particularly weren't known for their rushing or play extension. So he doesn't really have that experience of working off a quarterback and like the scramble drill and things like that. So with an early on in the Richardson era, where it's going to be, they're going to try to, make the numbers work better, where they're going to have to commit to defending the run against him, defending the run against Jonathan Taylor, and then defending the pass really third priority wise. Richardson might have to make, if he doesn't make the initial throw right away, he might have to, especially with how the offensive line looks, make some magic work behind the line of scrimmage and really try to just avoid pressure and make their guys get open downfield. So I wasn't the biggest fan of Downs' ability to do that. So he might be a draft pick where they have a guy in Isaiah McKenzie who's more that speed slot guy that they traditionally like that you talked about, or they have guys like Jack Stoll, tight end. I believe they still have him. I had their depth chart. I don't know why I just looked away from it. They have Jelani Woods and Moke Alley Cox, and they have a couple of tight ends that they're probably going to be able to turn out there and be like run that 12 personnel kind of stuff that you were talking about with Steichen, like run with emphasizing the run game. So even if he can't get on the field right away for them because of some stuff like that, while they work Richardson into being a more traditional drop back quarterback, I don't see a lot of time before he's one of those guys who's on the field consistently, even if he has to play more of that outside receiver look, because I doubt they'll be playing a lot of press man and things like that because they don't want to have that many guys up near line of scrimmage, so they'll run breaks. They don't have that much contain. Though I'm looking to see more when the teams play them, they're going to play their safeties back, really crowd the line of scrimmage with their backers and compress their defensive linemen to try to withstand that, and then have some guys back there for a last line of containment. So even if Downs struggles with some stuff with rolled up corners initially, I feel like he's going to transition more to an outside receiver role in that offense once they start getting to the identity they want to get to.
I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, Sam Howell is an underrated rushing quarterback. He cleared 800 yards rushing last year in his final year at North Carolina. And in that same season, Josh Downs had over 1,300 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns. So, that offense was basically Sam Howell and Josh Downs, effectively.
Yeah.
And so, there's a way for it to work. Certainly that's ACC versus, being in the AFC South. But, I'm curious to see how they have it planned out, because I don't get the feeling, without being in their draft room and following that team on a day-to-day basis, that was necessarily who they thought that they were going to go with, right? Like that I don't know if that type of player was necessarily in their plans, so to speak, but at some point you've just got to take him. All right, so let's move on to another team here that we haven't really talked about. The Washington Commanders. So the Washington Commanders, they go with Emmanuel Forbes in the first round. We kind of glossed over that on our first night just because we're kind of like, okay. Then they get Jatavius Martin in the second round. So they are really focusing on the secondary unit. And then in the third and fourth, they go back-to-back offensive line with Ricky Stromberg and Braden Daniels. So basically, this was more so than any of the others that we've talked about so far, like need. They're just like, pick players that we need this guy, we need this position, we need this position, we need this position. And now maybe that coincided well with their overall board, but at the same time, like, this is very clearly an emphasis on need. At least that's the way that I see it. So when you look at the first pick, Emmanuel Forbes, a lot of people really liked him, and the size was the big issue for him. And then Jatavius Martin, I think that he's kind of going to be a nickel guy. There's a lot of guys who are coming up on expiring contracts, and I think Cam Curl's one of them, might be looking for a substantial amount of money. And I think Jatavius Martin can probably fit into that at some point. So I'm not sure if he's going to be an immediate starter, but he's kind of in line there. And then the interior offensive linemen that they took are, certainly going to be players that are going to help out Sam Howell at some point. But, we're talking about barely in the top 100 here for Stromberg, and outside of it for Daniels. So you're wondering how much of an impact they're going to have. So how did you feel about the Commanders draft overall?
Yeah, so with Sean McDermott, like we were talking about, I'm more closely associated with the Bills. Sean McDermott was the defense coordinator for Ron Rivera when he was in Carolina, and his first few years here, a lot of the conversation was that this Ron Rivera kind of style defense really values. It's always that argument that comes back to coverage versus pass rush kind of thing. How much do obviously you want both, but which one do you prioritize one over the other? And it was always considered that this Ron Rivera style of defense, where it's more cover four, communication is key, really deep zone kind of things. It's going to be coverage over pass rush production, which we saw early on with the Bills. Not until just recently when they brought in Von Miller was when they started prioritizing that. So you already had the pass rush when it comes to Washington when you have guys like Chase Young and Deron Payne and things like that. So they already had that established. So now they're going to really give into that Ron Rivera kind of scheme where it's going to be, we're going to want to play this deep coverage. Emmanuel Forbes, before we got in here, I checked him out a little bit just to make sure I was talking with some more intelligence behind the kind of player. And he's definitely one of those guys, and I've heard people talk about him before. I even checked him out myself, but he was a lot more comfortable when it came to playing in that off coverage zone, even in the more shallow zones. Whereas when he was playing more of that press man, it was like he could get turned around a little bit. He wasn't the most comfortable in that technique. So he was kind of fit for one of these Fangio style or Rivera style defenses where he's going to be able to play with his eyes on the quarterback and read the field, read the different triangle between the receiver, quarterback, and himself. So that pick really played into their scheme. It may have been a little bit of a reach for me just from what other corners on the board, but for being as perfect as a schematic fit as he was for Rivera, I can see why they went with him there. And then, doubling down and really just picking up another nickel cornerback in Jartavius Martin, who's right now, according to our lads, slotted to be their starting slot. They have guys like Rashad Wildgoose and Troy Apke, who have been NFL veterans for the past few years now, that could push him for that. But he was a high second-round pick-ish. Like he wasn't I wouldn't say like one of the most notable ones, but he was still a second round pick that we're like, okay, he's going to probably get a chance to be a starter, and that defense he's going to start. We're going to have to figure that out. And you talked about guys like Cameron Curl, who may be looking to get a substantial raise in money after being a kind of better safety player in the past few years after drafting in the 7th round. So they've been talking about moving Benjamin St-Juste over there. From what I've been hearing, I want to make sure I'm getting this as well represented I can in honor of Nick, who usually is our Washington guy here. So I think they're really going and pushing for more of that coverage kind of system. And then with the addition of Brian Robinson last year, now withstanding the freak injury he got, they're probably going to want to stress that running game a little more, especially with Sam Howell, who we talked about. He is able to contribute with his legs, and I did think that was kind of an underrated part of his game. However, when it comes to passing the ball more or less, he does feel more comfortable in the pocket. When he did run, it was kind of just take off and get the yards, less extended plays and things like that. So establishing him with an offense where you're prioritizing running the ball with Brian Robinson, Antonio Gibson, the other running back's name is escaping me. Jared McKiss. No, what is his name? It's not even not.
It's
McKissick. Yeah.
It's but I think he was just on a 1-year deal, so I don't think he's back.
Yeah. They drafted Chris Rodriguez, and he's the one that's penciled in here on their depth chart. But the point stands, like they're really looking to, and even with like the backup quarterback being Jacoby Brissett now, they're probably looking to establish a team that's more strongly reliant on the interior run game, with the play action and working off of that. And if that isn't the work, if that the offense isn't really clicking in that game, which they're expecting to, having a quarterback who didn't really start all that much last year, and Jacoby Brissett, who's been a league average starter or like a below league average starter when he comes in, as kind of like one of the higher tier backups. They're not really relying on blowing people out of the water offensively. They're really relying on Eric Bieniemy scheming them up stuff, working that run game, working the play action. And if the offense isn't clicking, really rolling out that defense and trying to get that defense back to where it was a few seasons ago, where it was one of the top units, has one of the best defensive line starting rotations in there. And now they're just adding more depth pieces to the corner where they haven't really been able to put together a good unit back there. They had William Jackson for a bit. They've just been trying to find that answer at corner for themselves. And I think going with guys who are more scheme-specific fits, especially in the first 2 picks of their draft class, is probably them saying like, okay, we're going to focus our defense, and then bringing Bieniemy in is probably our number one addition to the offense. And we're just going to try to strengthen what we can and get guys to compete for starting jobs on the interior offensive line and really just establish like, hey, we're going to run the ball, we're going to work the play action, and we're going to play strong defense. That's how we're going to win games in an NFC East where there's a lot more of these high flying offenses with Dallas and even to some extent the Eagles now. So they're really, I think this draft class is kind of indicative of them putting more emphasis on that, especially with the fact that they weren't able to grab one of the top quarterbacks, according to the NFL in this draft class. So that's how I kind of interpreted what they drafted and what I felt about the guys they drafted, especially the corners at the top of the rounds there.
Yeah, interesting selection with Forbes. I kind of see it. So, we're going to do a deeper breakdown of his actual film and have that out tomorrow. Or again, like I said, if you're listening to this after the fact today. But he is a tremendous athlete. He's extremely twitchy. He's super fluid. And I think he's really special in that regard. I think he's pretty good in man coverage, but he can get out physicaled a little bit. But what he does really, really well, and I think is unique to him among all of the top corners, is his ability to play coverage and then transition essentially from corner to safety in the middle of a play is pretty cool. He's able to go from covering one guy to diagnosing the offense to reading the quarterback, and then he peels off and actually gets to where a safety would in an impactful way. That's something that I have not seen that I can remember, at least not breaking down film. And so when you combine the twitchiness and that style of play, you can see why he had so many turnovers and why everyone talks about his ball skills. He will jump routes as well, and he will bait you, but like he has a unique conglomeration of skills and tendencies that make him very enticing, but ultimately the size for him is a little bit worrisome. I think defending the run is going to be challenging for him. And then if you're putting on weight, is he going to lose that special twitchiness? You know what I mean? Is he going to be able to do that? You would think in the SEC that he already would have been, he would be over 170 pounds if he could be. And if not, then, is he dedicated or whatever the case might be? So, they took him high for a reason, and I think I see all those reasons, but I do wonder how effective he'll be in certain situations, and if teams will be able to victimize that a little bit at the next level. But that's pretty interesting. And again, I think for them, ultimately their draft is solid. It's really just a question of how good they'll be this year, pointing directly to the quarterback position. And so if they're able to have a good quarterback, then I think they can have a good season. I think their offensive skill players are really quite good. I don't think they're lacking really anything there. I think the interior of the offensive line is unspectacular, and some late round picks don't necessarily immediately help that. I think their tackle position is also unspectacular, but I think with everything else good, they may be able to overcome it. But I think if you also have unspectacular quarterback play, that's probably, a recipe for a 7-10 season, right? But they have opportunity. They really do to be good, especially if the defense is good. And I think Emmanuel Forbes is, the things he does well are NFL ready. And I think the size is really the biggest question there. But all right, let's move along to another team that we haven't talked about that much, and that would be the Green Bay Packers, right? So a lot of the Packers talk outside of Green Bay itself has been all about Aaron Rodgers, him moving on, the picks they got in return, the move up from 15 to 13, and then how Aaron Rodgers is doing in New York, and so on and so forth. The Jets kind of become the story more so than Green Bay. It's more about his exodus than the Packers themselves. And now we have a draft to talk about that we haven't really had the chance to break down yet. So in the first round, they got Lucas Van Ness. Van Ness is a guy that I really like personally. He's not like a incredibly refined player, but he is extremely powerful, and he is explosive in a power way, I guess is how you could put it. He's not just this big unmovable dude. Like he's got some speed to him, he's got some finesse to him, but power is the name of the game in terms of how he plays. And then let's see, I'm trying to remind myself here on the fly who there's.
I got their draft class pull up if you want me to read them through real quick. Yeah,
Well,
so
got
they
Musgrave
took
and go ahead.
Yeah, so they took Van Ness in the first, Luke Musgrave in the second, as well in the second they took Jaden Reed, and in the third they went with Tucker Kraft, the tight end of South Dakota State, and then I don't know if you want me to dive into the fourth, fifth, and sixth round, seventh round picks they took. They took a decent chunk of guys in those day 3 picks. Of note, probably Dontavian Wicks, another wide receiver out of Virginia, Kobe Wooden, the linebacker out of Auburn, quarterback Sean Clifford from Penn State for some reason. I mean, I guess they needed a backup, but yeah, they did definitely prioritize that, some of the needs they came into the draft looking at. So, and I'm totally there with you when it comes to Van Ness, especially with a team that developed a guy like Rashawn Gary, who is one of the best power pass rushers they have in the league right now. Not saying this guy's going to be Rashawn Gary. I was pretty high on Van Ness when the draft came around, and I'm not surprised where he went. And especially with what team took him, and if they can get a guy who eventually when I can't remember, is it Preston Smith that's still the one that's still there? I know Zadarius Smith, I think, went back to the Vikings.
Yeah, correct.
So with Preston Smith needing to eventually be either released because of his money wise, or he's going to retire, or whatever, he's getting up there when it comes to his tenure there with the Packers. They're going to need to find that guy who can be that kind of replacement. And with Van Ness being a guy who can play with power, but also has experience playing in like a 2-point stance, he wasn't like a traditional they didn't run. Iowa, it runs weird multiple front defenses anyway, so he has experience playing in different ways, whether it's reduced down inside, rushing off the edge, rushing with power, rushing off a 2-point stance. He has different variabilities that they're probably going to value. And like I said, this is a team that's coming from developing Rashawn Gary and is going to have a need for a secondary pass rusher opposite Gary when Preston Smith's finally gone. So I felt like that was a solid pick for them. And then moving on and going with the tight ends, Musgrave being that super athletic guy who from Oregon State, but he only played 2 games this past year. Really showed out at the Senior Bowl because of his athleticism and his kind of personality. So that's a pick where you're taking him to hopefully be a dynamic passing option for your offense. That really hasn't had that for a tight end. Like they had Robert Tonyan catch a bunch of touchdown passes, but he wasn't really anything spectacular for them. So they're hoping to get a high upside athletic guy in the form of Musgrave there. And then Jaden Reed, who was another one of those Senior Bowl guys who really popped and made a name for himself there. And it was as high as I think wide receiver 5 for some people that I was reading online. So I'm not as well versed with Jaden Reed as other people have been, but I have heard good things from him. And the one pick I really liked was the Tucker Kraft pick, doubling up on tight end, which I think a lot of people might have thought was a little bit confusing. But for a team that struggles to have receiver depth and has 2 backs like in Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, running 12 personnel with Jordan Love is going to be something they might want to look into doing. And I personally had Tucker Kraft graded the same as Luke Musgrave. Musgrave is definitely the better athlete and probably the better receiver, but Kraft I think is a better blocker day one than him, despite being probably a little smaller when it comes to like filled out frame wise and playing at a smaller school. So I really do think those 2 tight ends, they kind of complement each other well. And with Musgrave being that more athletic pass heavy option at tight end, as well as adding another receiving option opposite Christian Watson to really put enough support around Jordan Love and then establish that they want to start running the ball, take as much pressure off of him as possible with these 2 kind of dynamic, highly athletic tight ends, one of which has a little more blocking experience than the other, as well as having 2 of these outside receivers in Jaden Reed and Christian Watson. They're really establishing kind of a run-heavy play-action system there in Green Bay that they're going to want to take advantage of, which I think they've been trying to build towards since they drafted Love, since they grabbed Dillon in the second round, and they've kind of prioritized getting better in the run game. Now that Rodgers isn't there and they don't need to feed him his 40 attempts a game, they can really start building the offense and running the offense they've been trying to establish for a couple of years now.
Yeah, I think the offense needs a fair amount of help, and the tight ends went towards that. They selected a lot of players in this draft, and one of the biggest reasons for that is because they are hard up against the cap, particularly with Rodgers moving on. That's a big hit for them. So they needed to add a lot of guys very cheaply, and this is one way to do that. That's a little bit better than just visiting the undrafted free agent pool quite as heavily. I think defensively, I mean, the way that I interpret this is that, they run an odd front there more than most teams. So I assume that Devontae Wyatt and Van Ness will be playing those two defensive end positions with a 3-man front, so to speak, or 5-man front, or however you want to say it. They'll be playing end, and then you'll see Preston Smith and Rashawn Gary at the outside linebacker positions. Then you got Kenny Clark at nose tackle. That's what I suspect, right? And then you have Wyatt and Clark on the interior on pass rush downs, and then you can have whoever out there. You can have Smith, you can have Gary, you can rotate Van Ness, you can have all these guys. But run defense was an issue for them last year, and I think Van Ness, that's definitely one of his strengths. He's also probably, aside from Will Anderson, he's probably the best dual threat defensive end prospect in this draft when it comes to both stopping the run and rushing the passer. It's just that he is not necessarily a finesse or speed rusher, right? He's just, most of his pass rushing ability comes from power. So when you look at the run defense and that, he really brings the ability to be on the field all 3 downs, which some of the other guys early in their careers, maybe not so much. One is more a projection than the other for whichever it might be. So I think defensively, they've got themselves set up to be pretty good. You hope for another year of development from Quay Walker. You've got everyone else
punching
on the
less
defense.
refs. Hoping
What's
Quay
that?
Walker punches less refs.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you expect them to develop. You expect them to grow up a little bit. I think the offense is really where I'm a little bit more worried, because you look at it on paper, David Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon, and Zach Tom. I mean, on paper, that's nice, but there are a lot of question marks there. You know what I mean? David Bakhtiari being the single biggest one, but even Elton Jenkins, like health and these guys coming together, and then the inexperience of the quarterback, despite being in the league for a number of years at this point. We'll see. And then Sean Clifford, I mean, I'm not really sure exactly what the thought process was, aside from the fact that they need a backup that costs pennies. And when you're drafting somebody, in the 4th, 5th round, you're paying them very, very, very little. Even backups command multiple millions for the most part. And so this is kind of a guy that you're like, okay, he brings something to our room, and we don't have to pay him basically anything. So we'll see if he sticks or not, but that's, I think, the thought process there. So, I mean, what do you see as the ceiling for this offense? Like, what do you expect to come out of this year for the Packers on offense?
I know a lot of people are going to be focused on Jordan Love a lot. I think we could realistically see an offense that has 2, maybe, like, it's rare, and I want to say this kind of trepidatiously, but like 2 1,000-yard rushers potentially with Dillon and Jones, with how they're stacking up the tight ends. Like you said, on paper, they have a decent offensive line with the names they have, but they were kind of ravaged with injuries last year, and it's just kind of been a consistent thing for a guy like Bakhtiari. I am a fan of Rasheed Walker, who's their backup left tackle, but he was kind of more of a low upside, kind of, stopgap starter when I saw him coming out of the draft from Penn State. So they have a guy there that if Bakhtiari goes down, they could probably, have him pinch hit for a couple games, but they really needed the offensive line to stay healthy for them to establish that. But I could see the impact being more, people are going to want to talk about Jordan Love and talk about what he's doing there, but I could see him having games where he only throws for like 185 or barely cracks 200. However, they're winning in dominant fashion because they're able to control the ground game, really have Jordan Love just take some deep shots or really pick his moments where he has to make some clutch throws, and then playing with that strong defensive front where you explain, where like Kenny Clark can be your nose tackle, and then having Van Ness, these bigger body guys like Walker and Van Ness up on the line of scrimmage, and then when it comes to passing down, really flex those guys out, because like Van Ness can really work in space. And it really shows that like they're preparing to play against teams like the Bears, who have a running quarterback in Justin Fields and have added guys to help that running game out. They're going to be playing against the Lions, who had a strong running game last year, especially with like Jamal Williams, who is now gone, but they brought in David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. So you're expecting them to rely on their running game again this year. And then you look at teams that are in the NFC. So if they're hoping to compete in the NFC, you have teams like San Francisco, who really rely on running the ball to establish dominance. Seattle has a strong running game with kind of Walker coming back. And they just drafted, Zach Charbonnet. So you have these guys and these teams in NFC where we talk about with the AFC, it's all quarterback. The NFC is kind of shaping up with, and I think the Green Bay Packers kind of both molding their offense to meet that and molding the defense to stop against it. More run-heavy offenses that are going to try to grind it out, control the ground game, and then play good defense. I think the Packers are moving more towards that. And since, Jordan Love isn't Aaron Rodgers, they're not going to anticipate him throwing it all over the field and really blowing teams out with his arm, at least not right away in his first year of like a true starter.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I mean, when you just look at all the teams in the NFC, this is a good point. You now have, let's see, the Carolina Panthers, who have had a really good run game last year and will likely have a very good run game against this year. Chicago Bears, the Detroit Lions, you got the Green Bay Packers, you have the Los Angeles Rams, who, I mean, we'll see, but they traditionally have been a very run-heavy offense, despite, what everybody thinks about when they think offensive mastermind. It's a lot of running for them. You've got the New York Giants with Saquon Barkley. You got the Philadelphia Eagles. You got the San Francisco 49ers. You have the Washington Commanders, who I expect to run the ball a lot. And it's interesting that all of these teams, and the Atlanta Falcons, who I want to talk about next, especially after their investment in running back, these teams are really like they're saying, look, like if we are going to have a chance to compete in this conference, then we need to be able to run the ball. Like we need to be good offensively in some way. And if we don't have the quarterback, we better be able to run the ball very, very effectively. So this will be one of those rare eras, maybe even just for a year or two, where stylistically the conferences are very, very different. And we've had times where, there's been better offensive play in one or, than the other, but I'm not sure that it's been quite so divided in terms of the way that teams are going about doing this, because you're going to have teams that run the ball well in the AFC, but, you're also going to have the Bengals, you're going to have the Chiefs, you're going to have the Jets. Hopefully you're going to have the Jaguars, a lot of these teams that have, potentially very good quarterbacks throwing the ball around and weapons. So the highlight reels are going to look different. That's for sure. But all right, let's talk Falcons. So on draft night, first round, we obviously reacted to the pick of Bijan, 8th overall, but that's not the entirety of their draft, right? So when you look at round 2, they got Matthew Bergeron, the tackle out of Syracuse. They also got Zach Harrison, the edge from Ohio State, in 3rd round, Clark Phillips, the 3rd in the 4th round. So they got some names. And then they only had 2 more picks in the 7th round to close out the draft. But when you look at their top 4 picks, how did you feel that they improved their team? I mean, I think a lot of people thought defense was what they really needed, and they didn't address it until round 3. So, coming out of this, are you confident about the Falcons moving forward, or maybe a little more bearish?
I think when looking at the Falcons, we have to put in comparison, like they're not going to be a team when we talk about like what's their success mark going to be, their benchmark for success at the NFL or in the next NFL season. It's not going to be winning a Super Bowl as much as, Atlanta fans probably hope it is. It's going to be winning that division. And drafting a guy like Bijan, who now this is year 3 of this coaching staff, who came over from Tennessee, who had Derrick Henry, really wants to establish the run game. And they just had an offensive line that helped, what's his name? Oh, wow. I just blanked on it. Running back, BYU.
Tyler
I can't
Algier.
remember. Yeah, there you go. Algier. He just went for 10 yards. You have an offensive line that was able to propel him forward to do that. And now you have Bijan, who is one of the most talented running back prospects we've seen in a while, since probably Saquon coming into that system, where who knows how many yards he'll be able to get if Algier doesn't sap away some of it. But having too many good running backs in a system that relies on good running backs is never a bad thing. The one criticism you might say with that pick is that they didn't go quarterback, but if they weren't high on Will Levis, which it seemed like a lot of people weren't, then they weren't going to reach on a guy that they felt like, they have this generational running back talent right in front of them. They want to run the ball. Let's grab that guy first. And then, if we have to grab a quarterback later on or just roll what we got with our young guy and Desmond Ridder and our free agent pickup Taylor Heineke, then we can roll with that. And Heineke has proven to be able to be a winner. Ritter, they want to probably try to give him a chance to succeed, and providing him with weapons like Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and now an elite running game, which is probably it's going to be an elite running game with Bijan, and the fact of how well they were able to run the ball last year with a guy who was not Bijan Robinson. Let's be honest here. I feel like that really helped them establish and really cement putting Desmond Ritter as a priority there, and then adding Matthew Bergeron, who people saw a lot more as a left tackle, but they have Jake Matthews there, so he'll find a way onto this offensive line. Even though it's been a decently good line, they still have players who are competing for jobs, like that left guard spot with Matt Hennessy there, or at center where Hennessy used to be. You could probably see battles between him, Matthew Bergeron, that is, Hennessy, Jalen Mayfield, who was a highly touted pick a couple years ago for the Bears, I believe. Or there's going to be competition. They're going to get their best starting five out there, and they're going to want to emphasize running the ball. So I don't have a problem with them prioritizing offense in the first two picks anyway. Then when you look at the defensive picks they make, Zach Harrison, I was never the biggest fan of him back when in the 2020 draft cycle, when people were talking him up as like the big breakout candidate pass rusher that's going to go in the top 5 pass rushers kind of thing. Because he was a 5-star athlete. He played Ohio State. He had some good flash plays. But as you saw, as the time went on, yeah, he has the size and the strength to play the run really well. His pass rush has never really developed there. So they're probably bringing him in to be more of that, play side run defender kind of guy who maybe brings some upside in the pass rush. As we've talked about, the running the ball has really been an emphasis when it comes to teams in the NFC. And as well as Clark Phillips, I wasn't the biggest Clark Phillips fan, but they just made a trade for Jeff Okudah to play opposite AJ Terrell. And when I was watching Clark Phillips, I always thought not just the size concerns, but the fact that he's going to have to play more in like a zone with the eyes on his quarterback kind of system. Playing in more that slot corner role is going to really benefit him. And now that they have a guy on the outside of Okudah and a guy on the outside of AJ Terrell, they now have Clark Phillips who can come in and be that starting slot guy. So they're adding starters in the second, third round when it comes to offensive line, fourth round with Clark Phillips. So with a team that, was fighting for that division title last year with Carolina, and the other teams in the division have gotten probably worse outside of Carolina when it comes to like the Saints. They who knows what they're going to be with how much overturn they have there, as well as with the Bucks who lost out on Tom Brady. It's going to be a toss-up who wins the division, and bringing an elite player in and being like, we have the best player in division in Bijan Robinson. We're going to run the ball down your throat, and we've brought in more. We brought in starters in our mid-round picks, even though they're not high upside starters. They're still going to be starters for our defense and really improve that for us. So I wish they would have went maybe a little more heavy on defense, but what they did grab, I feel like really benefited them to meeting that success point they wanted to reach, which was winning their division this year.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think Bergeron is a guy who is probably going to be might be the worst player on their offensive line, but I say that in a good way, in the sense that they've got a lot of talented players there. Jake Matthews is a long-term veteran. Lindstrom is one of the better guards in the NFL. McGarry had a bit of a breakout season, so he's a pretty good player as well. So, I think that they have the opportunity to be absolutely dominant in the run game. That takes a lot of pressure off Desmond Ritter, and he's a guy who I would like to see if he can have some success. Because he was really good at Cincinnati, and I think that stylistically, he's not necessarily like a playmaker, but he can function very well within an offense. And I think that if you're going to not take a quarterback in this draft, he's a guy that you can, I think realistically take a swing on as a starter for a year without me saying that's insane or that's ridiculous. I think that he's accurate. He will he'll have an inaccurate pass here or there, but for the most part, he's accurate. It's not like his balls are all over the place or difficult to catch. I think it's just a little bit of a mechanics thing. And he's a little robotic, but we'll see what he looks like with a full off season to be projected the starter. Defensively, though, I just don't know. Ryan Nielsen's the defensive coordinator now. Dean Pease was there for a couple of years. He's been in the NFL forever. He's retired 4 times at this point, I think. He's literally, this might have been his 3rd retirement from the league. Traditionally he ran more of a 3-4, odd front things obviously changed a little bit in the NFL. Nielsen, he was with the Saints for a long time, and they don't run an odd front, but they do have those big defensive ends, which Zach Harrison definitely is. So I suspect that his fit there is probably pretty much perfect. But I'm not sure where the pass rush is coming from. Outside of Grady Jarrett, they just don't have anybody that has any kind of proven track record there. And then the back end, AJ Terrell's awesome, and they just went out and got the safety from the Bengals. What's his name?
Jesse Bates.
Bates, right? So they have some talent back there for sure, but secondary is a weak link unit, right? So if you're very strong in a couple spots, maybe not so much in some others, then we'll see. You know, add Clark Phillips, and maybe he's playing more on the interior, and then you got 3 out of 5, but what does the rest of the team necessarily look like back there? So I think they'll be good enough to win games. I'm just not sure they'll be good enough to make a real push. And 3 years in, I am a little bit worried about what that regime will look like at the end of this year, and if the patience will still be there. You know, Arthur Blank is generally a pretty good owner, but I'm not sure that he's going to be like down to run this back, right? And then are they coming back to the quarterback position, or are they addressing defense? So we'll see. But that's going to do it for us today for the Defiant Takes Football Show. I'm Max Dean. You can find me on Twitter at @TheMaxDean. Owen McCullor is at Weekly Huddle on Twitter. You can also find all of our written work at Defiant Takes Football. You can find Owen additionally at the Weekly Huddle on YouTube, which is his own channel, breaking down prospects and covering football. And you can find us tomorrow and or today or a few days ago, however works for you, breaking down Emmanuel Forbes, because we're catching up on those first-round picks that we didn't already have film breakdowns for. Owen, thanks for joining me. Appreciate you. And
Of course, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll see you all very soon.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.